Hello, this is Ryder Richards with Let Us Think About It. We have another interview today. This is a delightful conversation with Rebecca Coffey. She is the author of Science and Lust. This is available on Amazon or wherever you buy things that make you smarter. We cover a lot of ground here while primarily remaining focused on our shared heritage with great apes and our evolutionary basis for our behaviors. We discuss Freud, Darwin, Morris, natural selection or sexual selection, but basically how culture and sexual selection modify everything around us and our own behaviors. We talk about how women can be choosy and men can be indiscriminate. We talk about technology, romance, Japan, polygamy, incels, and mice wearing polyester pants. I hope you enjoy the interview. Hello, this is Ryder Richards with Let Us Think About It, and I have a guest with me today. This is Rebecca Coffey. She is the author of Science and Lust. We're going to be covering some topics, a lot of them involving humans as apes. And of course, specifically men tend to act like apes, but of course, females are apes as well. So we're going to start talking about some of those distinctions. Hey, Rebecca, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah, of course. So, of course, I have a lot of varied interests, as do you, and you've written for several publications, and so you have a lot of background in science as well as your own life experiences and observations. So I think when we get into some of this, maybe you can give us a short breakdown of course, why humans come out of this sort of bestial thing. And right, we have intelligence, we have this wonderful brain that sits on top of our head, but why do we not use it all the time?
Okay, so lots of great thinkers have tackled this. Freud was actually wrong about a lot of things, but right about a lot of things. And one of the things that he was right about was that our heritage from great apes informs a lot of our behavior. The scientist who really nailed it all, though, of course, was Charles Darwin, who was the father of evolutionary science. And what he pointed out was that there are two kinds of evolution at play. There's natural selection, which means everything happens by accident. And the accidents that work out are the ones that survive into the next generation. And natural selection, which is what that's called, he could have called it accidental selection, is aided and abetted by sexual selection. So the animals that can make themselves sexier are the ones who have more sex and father or mother more children. And what Darwin thought was that all animals, and plants too, but all animals are primarily on a fundamental DNA level concerned with passing their genetic information into subsequent generations. And so sex is enormously important because it helps that happen. And I will say this repeatedly. The way that men behave now is a product of billions of years of evolution. And what has survived is what works for them. So their behavior is a product of interacting with billions of years of very choosy females. And the way females operate is a product of dealing with not choosy males for billions of years. So males have this evolutionary directive to spread their seed. They don't care who gets it on an evolutionary level, right? Females have a different directive, which is to accept the seed of the strongest male, because they're going to have to bear the children and if they're mammals, raise the children, or put in some energy to raising the children. So these are colliding DNA encoded directives that are inescapable, except that yes, we are great apes, but we are also the most highly evolved great apes. So that we have words, memories, imaginations, humor. We have lots of things that facilitate our interactions, but also give us a consciousness, or should. So that while we have these drives that we're not necessarily even aware of, when a man dresses up to go out on a Match.com date, he is not necessarily thinking about impregnating that woman. It's the last thing on his mind. But on a biological level, he is. So we are biology, but we are also what we have evolved, which is consciousness and a culture. And it's valuable, and it is what has helped us evolve beyond being. We share a common ancestor with the chimps and the bonobos. That happened about 6.5 million years ago. They haven't evolved at all, really. They look and behave just the same. We are way different, and it's because of what we've evolved in our brains.
Yeah, and you sort of brought up culture there, right? That our culture helps shape us. And in
Right.
some ways, I'm assuming that it also sort of sets up some parameters that help all of us live together. In one of your articles, you talk about, I think it's Morris, talking about how we're just more crowded now.
Right, right. So, Freud thought that it was all about culture, and that in Civilization and Its Discontents, which he wrote in 1930, he was talking about we're apes at base, and we bring those things into our interactions, but culture and civilization is what makes us able to get along. Now, Desmond Morris looked at ape society, actual, gorilla, orangutan, chimps, and bonobos, and said, wait, they have rules. They all follow rules. There may be a dominant male. The dominant male may kill somebody he doesn't like. It may be a brutal society, but it is a culture. And if we have a culture today, it's because we have always known to have cultures ever since we became great apes.
Yeah, no, I mean that's one of the fascinating things about it, is that we do still have these cultures, but we have these impulses, and at times they seem to work in tandem to further our aims, but at other times they seem to be working sort of maybe against our bestial nature.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
a bit of
I
a
think
conflict.
it's just important to keep in mind that we are this way for a reason. We evolved to be this way because it works. But now we are at a state of evolution where we can also choose our behaviors.
Yes. And speaking of that, you, in one of your articles as well that I touched on, or I read just a bit, you were talking about the problems of course, that sort of stem from things like the Me Too movement, right? Which is men behaving badly.
Right.
And we had just briefly bounced back and forth a question, and it's yes, men are behaving badly, but of course women are involved in this society as well. And so sort of how should their role in the future be, right? Is this there's a lot of talk about the patriarchy and tyranny and dominance by males in our society. But of course, there's two sexes, and both of them are equally intelligent and have their own mechanisms for behavior. So can you talk a little bit about how that might play out as we move into the future?
Yeah, I think that there's an intergenerational conflict or difference in how women interpret the Me Too movement. Women my age, and I'm in my 60s, we grew up with sharp elbows. Men behaved in this kind of predatory way, and women knew that their power was to refuse. They got to refuse. Now, we also grew up in a culture where saying no didn't always serve us, right? I mean, it was still a very treacherous culture for young women. But now back then we did understand that men were behaving like men. And now I think many women don't understand why they behave that way. Well, they behave that way because they're animals. And you're behaving the way you are because you're an animal. And no, we don't have to accept that behavior. We can all insist that we rise above it, but the behavior is not coming from nowhere. And more importantly, we don't want them to stop behaving sexually, because if they did, the human species would die out.
Right, yes. My wife and I traveled to Japan a couple of years ago, and we were talking to some people there, and they're having, of course, declining birth rates, and they've gotten to the point where the state is now having singles events to try to get young people to hang out together. But one of the people we were talking with said that it's because of the sort of prudish morality that has evolved since World War II in their culture. They have become champions of their own prudishness, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so now young men and women don't know how to interact. And this is leading to a lot of problems for their country.
And in fact, I think, these days it's very popular to say that gender is a spectrum and sexual preference is a spectrum. And I think one of the reasons that that point of view is so popular is that we don't know how to behave with each other from opposite ends of the spectrum. Mm. And those people who are willing and able and excited about inhabiting the middle have friends and love in their life and not as much tension. I mean, it works. It seems to be an adaptive solution to a sexual problem.
Yeah, no, it was, that is kind of one of those questions that I think was rattling around in my head is that we're, I guess, getting to a point where we need to accept difference. And I like this idea, though, that spectrum allows people to operate out of a ground that isn't as maybe territorialized.
Right.
So we sort of deterritorialize the middle, and then people can exist in there. And these urges at some point, right, maybe the urge is to procreate, but maybe that's not the goal anymore. So the goal might end up, you were talking about relationships and developing these deep, rich relationships. Does that also go back to our ancestors?
So, yeah, it does. So about 1.8 million years ago, what we can tell from looking at skulls is that skull sizes got enormous, which would have created a plummet in the population numbers, because those babies aren't going to fit through a birth canal. Mm. So the mothers and the babies died, right? And that meant that the women who were genetically unable to carry an infant to term were the ones who survived. They just had extremely small and vulnerable babies, right? But all of a sudden, their gene pool, their genes were dominating the gene pool. And what they needed was a lot of help, because they had these terrifyingly young infants. And so men, if they wanted their progeny to survive, had to help out. Mm. And then about 1.3 million years ago, the skull size seemed to max out and got a little smaller. And then by somewhere between 70 and 50,000 years ago, so not very long ago, what's called the Broca area of the brain, and it's in the left hemisphere, right near the motor complex. That's when we got language and imaginations, probably, and humor and gossip and all those things that I said were healthy, and let men and women have intimate conversations. Let them make promises to each other. So that as brain size changed, so did the survival needs of the women and their children. And the survival needs dictated closeness between men and women. And that allowed for the family unit and probably even romance to develop.
And yeah, speaking of romance, that seems to also be, at least the Western European idea of romance, that seems to be a fairly novel thing, right? That it hasn't maybe always
existed. Well, yes and no.
You know,
when I was in college, we were told that romance began with chivalry in the Middle Ages, and there was nothing like it before the days of the court, really.
Okay.
And but I don't remember, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, a researcher from the University of Nevada at Las Vegas, I think it was, examined the data on 183 or so cultures worldwide, and he found evidence of romance in something like 90% of them. And so this includes very primitive cultures. And I talked to him for an article, and he said that what he had done that was different from some of the other researchers was that he had, rather than just looking at the data, he had called them. And he had said, well, so was there any evidence, for example, of suicide? And they said, oh yeah, a guy hung himself from the tree canopy. And he said, well, why did he do that? And he said, because a woman wouldn't take him on. And the guy said, you don't kill yourself over sex. You kill yourself over romantic love. And so a lot of those numbers were artificially deflated. Romance seemed really to be an artifact of Western culture. But when you look at the behaviors of the people in the more primitive cultures, you can see that they may not be writing odes to each other, but they were heartsick sometimes. So romance is part of the human condition.
Yeah, and then there's also, I guess, long-term mating that happens with several primates.
Right. Well, actually, great apes, here's the tragedy of female gorilla life. You're in a harem, and there are maybe only 2 or 3 of you in the harem. And at least you get sisters, right? Harem sisters. But if another gorilla sees you and wants you, what he's going to do is come in and kill your child that you're nursing. And you are going to fight like hell. You are going to fight till within an inch of your life. And if you lose and your baby dies, you will run off with him and he will be your mate. I'm assuming because you understand that you need to be mated to the biggest, strongest dude around. And if you're with him, that will never happen to a child of yours again. So gorillas mate kind of permanently in that way. But bonobos will have sex with anybody, including children, and they'll do it 24 hours a day. Chimps, and it doesn't matter if the women are fertile or not. They just want to have sex, and they'll have sex with women. They'll have sex with men. The men have a very charming way of having sex with each other. They dangle from trees by their legs. Great apes don't have tails, and they get their penises up near each other and they bat them against each other. It's called penis fencing.
Yeah, I've heard it called sword fighting.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
But
it reminds me of like Spider-Man, where they're hanging upside down.
Exactly. But great apes are by and large not romantic. Birds often mate monogamously. But usually, even though they appear to be monogamous, they're not. Molecular biological assessments of offspring often show that the mothers cheat. And in black vulture culture, and black vultures mate for life, and so people have always assumed that they're monogamous. Males cheat. And when males cheat and their relatives find out about it, they beat them up. So,
I hear there's, of course, we're talking coming back to sort of current times, and we're talking about culture and these ideas of sort of marriage and monogamy versus sort of polyamory or something like this.
Yeah.
Then I guess there seems to be precedent for both, at least in the animal kingdom.
Right. Animals are probably more often polygamous than not. In human cultures, more than 80% allow polygamy, official polygamy. But the only men who engage in official polygamy are the ones who are wealthy enough to support multiple families. And that has a societal cost because those guys hog all the good women. And when there aren't enough women to go around, unmated men are kind of dangerous to society. I can't remember the names of the researchers, but they found that unmarried men are something like 3 times more likely between the ages of 24 and 35 of murdering another man.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you want, if you were God, you would want those men to have mates. But polygamy messes that up. Not everybody gets a mate.
Yeah, and I guess that leads us, into this idea of the incels, right? The involuntary celibates.
Exactly. It's an age-old problem. Now, everybody likes to believe that men are the promiscuous ones and women are just staying home and holding down the fort and have no interest in polygamy. And again, I'm sorry that I don't remember the researchers on this because it's a wonderful study. They took a bunch of young men and women and they gave them surveys about their sexual histories. And there were 3 conditions. Condition 1 was that their answers would remain absolutely confidential. Condition 2 was that the answers would be reviewed by a peer reviewer, meaning that another student or another young woman or man would get to know what the numbers were, right? And the 3rd condition was that the people were strapped to lie detectors. Now, the lie detectors were fake. They were entirely fake, but the people were strapped to them and they didn't know that. In condition 1 and 2, the group's admissions of their sexual past conformed to sexual stereotypes. Women hadn't had many partners and men had had lots. In condition 3, where they thought that their lies would be noticeable, women as a group outscored men as a group.
As far as sexual partners?
Yeah. So we are not the passive homebodies that you would think.
I mean, yeah, it's one of those things that's really, I think, being shaken up in culture quite a bit, right? Is that, that of course women have desires and urges and are doing things as well, and the kind of classic motif that at least I was raised with. I was raised in the church, and it was, there was basically your parents only had sex just to procreate that one time or whatever, and so as we kind of move outward from those little small communities, you sort of see that everyone has their own intentions and it's their own strategies to survive as well, right? And that romance solves some things, and then for other things, it's purely lust. And kind of looking around, I'm sort of interested in. There seems to be an openness to sexuality, and I remember, reading about the 60s counterculture movements and free love and all this, and then we're at a stage now as well where there's a lot of people that sort of agree again that this should be more along the lines of what we do, no sort of marriage contracts or ownership or property or anything like that.
Right. Yeah. I think that dating sites like Match.com are actually probably changing women in a profound and beneficial way, because culturally we are told to be passive. We're going to be chosen, right? We're waiting to be chosen. Well, when you go on a dating site, you are, first of all, admitting that you are looking, right? So that's step one. And you have to admit that to yourself before you admit it to Match.com, right? By virtue of being there, you are being public about the fact that you are looking for a match. And then you have to write your profile, which kind of includes what you want. You have to examine what you want. And then as these guys approach you or you approach them, you have to evaluate whether this is worthy of a drink, a dinner, or just an afternoon cup of coffee. You take on agency for yourself as a sexual and romantic human being. That is a huge change for women.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of the dating sites as well, there was a lady wrote an article that was very much about the side of the surveillance capitalism and how that technology is also being used against people, because they can see when you're fragile, they can see when you're vulnerable by your behavior patterns on those sites.
Yes.
And they use that to sell you things at your most vulnerable time periods. Mm-hmm. And so this is, once again, I think it goes back to that we are animals, that we have these emotional drives, and not everything is rational, and those can also sort of be harnessed and used against us.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I'm always amused that right after Thanksgiving, because I'm in my 60s, my ads on Facebook changed to shapewear and muumuus, because they think that I've overeaten and that I am filled with shame about it.
It's funny when it's wrong too, right?
Yeah.
It seems so glaringly obvious when it's wrong, but when it's right, you're just like, oh my goodness, they know who I am.
They've been listening, and in fact, Siri and Alexa do listen. And so I remember having a conversation with my sister about pajamas, and we were making jokes about, we have to get upscale pajamas, and then I went on Facebook and they were all ads for upscale pajamas.
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was talking with someone on the phone the other day about meditation, and then they started sending me screenshots of their Instagram feed, and it was all meditation apps.
Yeah.
And you just go, wait, was that there previously and we just didn't see it?
No,
or
that is Siri or Alexa listening in.
Well, and that, I think, leading back into our conversation about how we handle technology, right? That, of course, we're so smart and so rational. We have these huge brains, and we can figure all these things out. We can build the technology to help us move through the world in different ways, sort of this extension of ourselves, these tools. And yet, of course, we're also seeing that some of the smartest people of our generation are now building softwares to take advantage of the sort of more animal nature that we have, to sort of hack the human behavior system. And this has me a little bit worried, because I simply don't know where it goes. And if we are so extremely hackable, then have we had time to develop defenses against this?
Well, Darwin would say that evolution always happens in response to environmental change. And you were describing a huge environmental change. So it'll be interesting to see how we respond. The way Darwin defined evolution was, he never knew what a gene was, because nobody had identified those yet. But he's really talking about genetic change, that it's slow and incremental. And so by Darwin's rules, we may not be able to evolve quickly enough, but there was a rival to Darwin named Lamarck, and Lamarck came up with what he called, maybe we call it, epigenetics, with epi being a Greek prefix meaning above genetics. And basically what it is saying is that to a certain extent, learned behavior can be inherited. And there have been some interesting experiments with yeast, for example. Yeast can learn about environmental conditions and pass that quickly on to their progeny far more. The whole bunch of them will change at the same time, and so that's not a generational thing. The next generation of progeny will have it. And so there have been experiments showing epigenetic evolution. Is there such a thing? I don't know. If there is, maybe we will survive the coming years.
Yeah. Yes, one of the things I was reading about with epigenetics, and it's also just passed down trauma as well, that scarification of sperm and things like that.
Yeah, and the hunger. There was a famine in, I think it was Holland, during the war, because what Holland had done was Holland was occupied, but the government in exile shut down the trains so that food deliveries couldn't make it in, and then the Nazis responded, and there was starvation, right? And some women were pregnant during the time, and their children tended to grow up with, I think it's basically eating disorders, that they never got over the lesson of needing more and more and more and more nutrition. Now that's a one generation change that suggests that epigenetics might be at play.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's good that our species can react in that way. Then again, it's difficult to think that the traumas of the parents are passed on to the children, right?
Right.
That's quite difficult to get past.
Right, and we certainly know that that's true just on a psychological level, that a traumatized parent raises children differently because they react to the environment differently, and they bring fear or coping or whatever into the culture of the family. I years ago wrote a book that required me to attend a writing group of Holocaust survivors. And one of the lessons that I came away with was that again and again they said, why would I forget? That people tell me to forget and move on. Why would I forget? The world is very dangerous, and I have my antenna up. I'm ready to perceive danger. A person like that raises a hyper-aware child.
Right. Yeah. And, I remember reading something about our memory for pain is actually quite bad. And I don't know if that's actually true, but like if you break your arm, then that excruciating pain goes through you, yet 6 weeks later you're on the skateboard again.
Exactly. Or if you have a baby and
yes.
that hurts like nothing.
I wouldn't know, but I could imagine, yeah.
Then you have another one, and you think, I was lying there on the table with my second child, and I thought, what the heck? How did I let this happen again?
Right. And yeah, which is, of course, our species wouldn't move on if
we
didn't
forget it.
Yeah, if we had perfect memories.
Yeah. We wouldn't want them.
No.
Yeah.
Circling back around, one of your articles talks about something I found really hysterical, but the idea of these mice that would wear polyester pants.
Oh God, that's my favorite story. So I get
crazy.
I do a fair number of webinars and before the pandemic speeches. So I got to tell this wrapped in the story of, I wrote a novel, came out in 2014, called Hysterical, Anna Freud's Story. And it was a heavily fact-based story revealing that Sigmund Freud well, first of all, that she was gay, and he said that homosexuality in men was fine, but lesbianism in women is a gateway to mental illness. He said it was always caused by the father, which in his case would have been him, or in Anna's case would have been him, and it was always curable by psychoanalysis, if the psychoanalyst was good. So he psychoanalyzed her. And he had also said to all of his followers, never, ever, ever psychoanalyze your child, because it is an erotic relationship, and you can't do that. So he broke all of his rules, and this whole thing was repressed. So I came out with this book and somehow got invited to Buenos Aires to speak to the 50th convention of Freud's own International Psychoanalytic Association. And I got there, and it was a huge bunch of very angry people. And so I began by telling that story that you've just asked for. So it was an Egyptian urologist, and he did an experiment with 75 lab rats, and he gave some of them, he put all of them in pants. He gave some of them cotton pants, some of them a collie-cotton blend, some of them polyester pants, and some of them no pants at all. And then he watched them mate for a year. And the rats in polyester pants had much less sex than anybody else. And he thought it was the electrostatic potential in the pants that rats were getting shocked. And I said that I thought it might have been just an intimacy problem. Like, what rat in her right mind would have sex with somebody in polyester pants? And then I wrapped up that speech, and then I got into all the stuff that they were going to be really mad at me about. And then I wrapped up the speech with the story. I asked them, what do you think the animal is that humans are most intimate with? And they all said dogs and cats. And I said, no, there are little arachnids on your face, and they are on every human's face, and you can take alcohol to your face and you can kill them off, and they will be back the next day. And I described them. They have no rectums, and so they are just filled with their own excrement until they die, at which point it kind of melts all over your face. And every night they come out and they have sex on your face. And I just left them with that. And then it like they couldn't figure out why the talk was stopping there. And I said, well, you're all psychoanalysts. How does that make you feel? And it brought down the house. So they could no longer hate me for the information I had given them. They could no longer hate me.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I do think that there's something fascinating about going into it just reminds me of these kind of Zizek things where you go into a conference and the best way, you can say all sorts of things, but if you tell the right joke at the right time, everyone's your friend.
Yeah, exactly. And I was terrified to go into that. And my sister-in-law, who's a psychologist, had warned me to refuse the invitation. But I thought, what is my obligation in there? I have to tell a good joke, tell a good story, and not lie.
Yeah. This sounds great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Rebecca, this has been absolutely fantastic.
I enjoyed it too.
Good. You've written quite a bit, and I know you have a book out right now, and we're going to plug that a little bit on the website. But is there a little summary you want to give to our listeners?
Just remember that you're animals, and don't expect us to strip sexual behavior out of daily interactions. But also remember that you're humans, and you're supposed to be evolved past forcing it on each other or allowing it to be forced on you. And women, I know that's nearly impossible sometimes. That's the struggle, and I support you in it.
Thank you. This has been great.
All right. It's been great for me, too.
All right. Thank you so much. Once again, Rebecca Coffey's book is Science and Lust. We're going to link to it on the website, letusthinkaboutit.com. And of course, you know the drill, rate, review, and share. And of course, if you like the show, please support us at the website with either a one-time $5 donation or a monthly $5 contribution, whatever you choose. Until next time, stay safe.